Woo! All right, my favorite topic in the whole wide world is budgets.
Bud gets.
So excited for talking about
Budgets. Yeah.
So like the reason a budget is good, like we slightly touched on this last week. Actually, I don't think any of it made the video, so I don't think we touched on it at all last week. But yeah, none of it made the cut for reasons.
It was that good.
Yeah, it was too good. It was too good. We had to cut it all out and make it a whole episode by itself. So the dangerous part about budgets is they all have to be done up front. And you have no idea how long it's going to take, and how much it's going to cost, and how many team members you're going to need. Like before you like, you know what you want to build. Generally speaking, you know what you want to build. Like let's say I'm a product owner, and I generally know what I want to build, but I don't have a team, and like I don't know how much it's going to cost to build the whole thing. So like I can just pull a number out of the air.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I guess when I'm starting a project from the ground up, like maybe I guess I should just pull a number out of the air. But like, how would you even get started? Like you're like, let's say you're in a firm, and your firm is dedicated to agile development. Okay, you don't have a team yet. You come up with an idea for a brand new product, right? I'm going to start this discussion with a theoretical, and we'll see where this goes. I have no idea where it's going to go. You come up with an idea for a new product. You have a product owner. Maybe it's one you've taken a product owner from another product or whatever, you brought it over here. You need to bring up a whole new team, and you need to bring up a whole new whatever. You don't even have it, but you don't know how much it's going to cost. So like, where do you even start?
So one of the first things you would do is look at the portfolio of projects that have already been delivered at the firm and see if there's anything remotely close to what you're trying to do. Right? It's what they call analogous estimation. So look for something that exists. Even if it's not exact, it's okay if it's similar. Whether it's a web app or whether it's global or local, that kind of thing. Look at that and say, it took X to build that. We're not going to be too far off, right? We'll be in the same zip code at least if we say ours is similar, so it's around that. That's a better starting point than just picking a number out of the air. But to your point, budgets are a necessary evil. You have to have them because you got to fund the project somehow. And traditionally, the way it's been is people have always raced with each other, right, to try and get the funding.
Yeah.
So you have multiple sources of competing, needs, I guess, right? And people are saying, well, fund my project, so it's more important. Here's a business case, and you lobby for that. Somebody's doing the same thing. Somebody else is doing the same thing. So ultimately, pretty much at random almost, everybody is given a budget. It's like a number that you're told to not exceed. That's really what it amounts to. And so if you meet that number or stay below it and you deliver a product, great. Guess what happens then? You're applauded, right? You pat on the back, and you're told, excellent, you get to pick again, right? Mm-hmm. So this thing continues, this idea of doing budgets. Unfortunately, these are on an annual cycle in most organizations, right?
Yeah, annual, yeah.
And then the other thing that happens is, so before we go to the other thing, why is it a problem that they're annual? It's a problem because if your project is 6 months or 3 months or you don't really know how long, right? But it's not a year, let's say.
Right.
Then it's just a total guesstimate. But what if your project is 3 years long and you still got an annual budget? It's still a problem, right?
Yeah.
So all around it's a problem. But the other thing that happens is with these budgets, unfortunately, it comes with a condition, right? And that is, if by the end of the fiscal year you haven't used your budget, you lose it. Mm-hmm. Well, if I'm lobbying for a budget, it's hard work to compete with my compadres, and I get a budget approved for me. And if I don't use it all, I should be applauded for that. You haven't used up all your budget.
Right. Yeah,
great.
right.
Guess what? You get to carry it forward. No.
You should.
You should. Yeah. But no, what happens in reality is I lose it. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually penalized for that, believe it or not, because next year when I submit a budget, they're going to say, last year you asked for $2 million, you only used about 1.3. We're not going to give you 2 again.
Yeah.
Right? So that's actually the wrong behavior. But unfortunately, we're geared up that way through decades of this annual budgeting that is ingrained in most organizations. So what are our choices? How do we change things?
Yeah, that seems like an old school version of budgeting that doesn't really match like that. But I have to stop you here. I have to stop you here because the old school version of budgeting doesn't really match with well, I'm going to build features until you tell me you've had enough features, and then once you tell me you've had enough features, I'll stop asking for money or what. I mean, the budget really is you're buying features as they're developed.
Yes.
So that the old school I'll get a brick of money and I'll just whatever, use it for the whole year or whatever. I mean, I guess that's cool if you're. I guess that version could be sort of retrofitted in. I tried to talk about this last time, but it was I was too far gone by this time. But that version of budgeting could be retrofitted in, I feel, if you have a mature team and a mature product owner with a mature velocity that's predictable every time, and you have a certain amount that, then your organization could know that well, my team in the last 2 years has produced X number of features and it's cost this much or whatever, so I know that I need a lot certain amount, and you can kind of retrofit some in. But you would never, I can't even imagine you would ever be allowed to retrofit something in, because you need to take a chance to figure out how to work this way before you can retrofit it in or whatever. It makes no sense to me. The topic of budgeting makes no sense to me, because in an organization that is what you were describing, coming up with your annual budget and sort of allotting it out or whatever, it seems like when you go to plug Agile into that, your Agile will now form itself into little mini waterfalls in order to fit the budgeting that's aligned with, rather than we're going to give the department a budget of this, and then we're going to get whatever features we get out of it at the end of that time. I don't know. Is it? Do you need to change the organization to be more experimental in order for this to work out, to be able to make that change? This seems like a much higher level than most people are exposed to. Higher level. A much more senior level in the organization than many other people who are in Scrum Master or maybe even product owner roles are exposed to. That's why I bring it up. I'm very interested in this topic.
You're absolutely right. It is at a higher level strategically, right? Yeah. It's in the organizational DNA as to how they do budgeting, and it fundamentally requires a complete transformation in that. But it's very difficult because the traditional way of budgeting was never geared up around an Agile delivery way, right? It was rather construed for hard things, you produce this widget and you manufacture it. So it's going to take you X number of weeks, months, or whatever to produce X or Y number of these widgets.
Yeah.
Well, software manufacturing is a little different, right? Especially when you don't have the scope that's bound in Agile. Yeah. So you have a budget that's fixed, right? You have a timeline that's fixed, but the scope flexes in Agile. So traditional way of budgeting really doesn't fit very well with this.
Right.
And that's where people run afoul, because they're looking at this saying, here's some money, go make something happen. And but you don't know what you need yet because the features aren't defined, to your point. So even though, let's say, by some miracle, you managed to launch a product by that time within that budget, let's say, that's still a failure because you didn't decide up front the features. Mm-hmm. So when you launch something, inevitably there are going to be features that aren't there. And so they're going to say, we used up the budget and these things aren't there, right? The whole thing is set up that way. Now, organizations that are succeeding in the Agile delivery method are not using these traditional ways of budgeting.
Yeah.
They are actually starting from the ground up by looking at value streams and funding those, right? And I think that's a valid angle, because ultimately, why are you spending money, right? You're spending money as an investment to either save costs or make money, make profits. In either case, or in both cases, I should say, it is reasonable to be able to justify a value stream. If we spend X amount of money, then we expect to receive a revenue stream over this many months, years, whatever time frame it is. Yeah. So then you can look at that as a financial model and say, is it worthwhile us investing in this? Yeah. Right? Yeah. Figure out your net present value and all of these good things. So I think those organizations that are delivering software in an Agile way are not using Agile budgeting that is traditional in nature. What they're doing is they're using what I can only describe as micro budgeting. And this is quite interesting. So say you have an organization that has 18 people that are looking for money, for want of a better expression, right? So, but you don't have enough money to divide amongst all 18. So what you're going to do is you're going to tell people, okay, let's look at every project and see what it's worth to the organization. Where's the potential for revenue generation or cost savings? And prioritize those projects further up, right? And give those projects some money, but not all the money they ask for necessarily. And here you could be time-based, right? That's one element.
Time-based,
right? So you say, well, we'll give you enough money for 3 months and see what you come up with.
That's what I was just thinking of when you were describing this. I was like, well, maybe I'll give you 6 months worth of money. In my head, it was 6 months, but you're probably right. It's probably closer to 3 months. We'll do 3 months at a time and figure out.
So it depends on the industry. I mean, if you're working on, let's say Boeing jets, it might be a bit longer. But yes. I kind of want to see where you're going with this, but I also want to stop because I want to bring it back to But if I have not even started yet, I have no idea how much money that needs to be. I mean, that's probably not true though, because I probably know I need at least let's talk about software, because we could apply this to anything, but for software, let me start with saying I need 3 developers, I need 1 tester. You probably kind of wing it. You probably can kind of wing it. It'd be like, well, I need 3 developers. We did this before because I had my calculator out and I couldn't figure out how to do math. But you need 3 developers. Let's pretend for a second you need 3 developers, a tester, a product owner, and a scrum master. 6 people. Let's pretend for a second they all get paid $100,000. I need $600,000 in my budget. Maybe I can flex, because even project managers, like PMP certified project managers, add flex to their budget. Even they are 25% overhead, whatever, a little bit of, they add a little 30% flex, whatever they add, 30. I think that the PMP project managers I've worked with in my career, they've added somewhere between 30 and 50% flex in their budget, believe it or not. I don't know if that seems weird to you, but whenever I ask them how much bandwidth do we have, they tell me they've planned anywhere between 30 and 50%. That seems a little generous. As a recovering PMP, I've never had the luxury of adding that much. But I get your point, right?
They add padding, right? Everybody does. Yeah.
They call it contingency funding.
Yeah,
right?
whatever, man.
It's the same thing.
Yeah, but the point is, I consider this to be the most difficult case, which is you don't have a team, you don't know how much it costs. So it's you kind of have to figure I just need to pick a number out of the air. You know what I mean? I need to pick a number out of the air. Let's say it's $100,000 per person. Pick a number out of the air. Put that down in my budget. 6 people, $100,000 each, $600,000. 12 months, obviously. So cut that. 6 months to be $300,000 or whatever. Okay, so $300,000, 6 months. What can we deliver in that 6 months? Well, we don't. These are the things we're going to try to deliver or whatever. But I need a number to go up to ask for before I can even build my team and start my team and do whatever,
Yeah, so one of the approaches you could take potentially is to look at the product you're trying to build and really, really aggressively drill down to an MVP, right?
Sure.
This is strictly the needs and not the wants, wishes, and desires. Put them aside.
Yeah.
So now you have the needs. And then what you could do is enumerate those and say, we have to have these things. And if you don't have a team, it makes it very difficult to estimate what it's going to take to get there.
Oh, yes, sir.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you have somebody who's done something similar, it can be an enterprise architect, somebody like that, and they can give you a broad estimate. That's good enough to start with.
Yeah.
It lands you somewhere, right? So you take that, of course, add the prerequisite, overhead to that, contingency, etc., and start with that and say, for an MVP, we think we're going to need this, plus or minus X%. But you're probably going to get what you asked for at that point, not more, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's okay. And then see how it goes, right? Spin up the team, develop, and keep tracking to that. Now, understand, this is not the end result. This is simply an MVP that you think you want.
Right.
That's going to morph over time. Some things will come into the picture as MVP because you didn't think of them up front.
Yeah.
And the product owner will be able to say, yeah, well, that can wait, right? That's okay. It comes out in the wash. But at that first MVP release, look at your budget and see where you're at, right? If you're within, let's say, X percent. I don't want to put a number on it because it's contextual, but let's
Sure.
say you're close. You're close to delivering it, but you just need that little bit extra to get there.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think will happen if you went back to the well and said, we're really close, but we're going to need, an extra X $1,000 to make it. You're going to get it.
All project managers do that.
Yeah,
all project managers meet with a steering committee or executive committee or whatever and say,
Right.
"Hey, my project's here. We look like we're going to go over." Like they all do that anyway.
Exactly. Well, that phase gate stuff. But
Yeah,
I
phase
think
gate, yeah,
if
exactly,
you do
yeah,
it
yeah.
once,
Yeah.
if you do it once for MVP, now, and you get that, let's just assume for the sake of argument, that you're going to get that approved, that little delta.
Right.
So now you have what you had plus the delta.
Yeah.
Add that up, that's your MVP.
Yeah,
right?
they all do change request. What is it called? Change request or whatever. The change. I can't remember what it's called.
Change orders.
Change
and
orders.
stuff.
Change orders. Yeah, that's what they call it. They call
Yeah.
it change orders. They all do change orders and stuff like that. Like here's your initial statement of work, or whatever, and here's change order number 1, and here's change order number 2, and there's a scope defined in that. They all do that anyway. So like all that's baked into like we can reuse all the architecture they're using for what we're talking about.
But with a real strict focus on MVP alone.
Right. Yes,
right?
right, yeah.
And if you get to that point and you still have features that are needed, sorry, I'm going to be clear about my language, right? So features that were needed for MVP have already been taken into account.
Yeah.
So now you can go live with something, but it needs a little bit more finesse.
Yeah.
That part can be post MVP, and that's a different micro budget.
Yeah.
And so if it didn't happen, you could still have a usable product, right? I think that approach has merit.
Mm-hmm.
I think the approach of getting money up front just based on some silly assumption and then finding yourself scampering to use it up by a deadline, right? And then not being able to, what ends up, I've seen this. What ends up happening is people say, I've got to use this money somehow.
Yeah.
So you're going on a training class because I've got money and I'm going to lose it, right? What a waste.
Mm-hmm.
So that traditional way of budgeting has an incredible amount of waste. And doing it with a value stream approach eliminates the waste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So like let me reframe this topic to do like this. Let's say for example, like I'm the CEO now. Like look at me, I'm the captain now. Like I've got money, and I come to you and I'm like, I want to build. Like I have this idea for a new product and to break into this new market or whatever it is. I don't know. Widget A for market B or whatever. And I pitch my idea to you, and you kind of understand it, or I get the idea to you where you understand it, and I'm like, all right, here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to spin up a team. Like you're gonna like, if I'm pitching the idea to you, my idea is like you're gonna be. I probably should reframe this for a second. Let me pitch this idea to you for a second, okay?
Sure.
I'm the CEO now. You're an agile coach that works in my organization, but I've decided I want to produce a new widget or whatever, piece of product, whatever. So I'm willing to spend a certain amount of money. I tell you, I'm willing to spend $300,000
Yep.
In the next year in order to try to evaluate this idea or to try to bring some kind of product to market. I'm going to give you $300,000. I'm going to take $300,000. I'm going to put it into an account. You're going to have access to that account. Whatever you need to do is spin up a team, however you feel like or whatever. Like I'm giving it to you. Like you're not necessarily the product owner in this instance, but you're like I'm going to put you in that pseudo project manager kind of situation where like you can hire a product owner and have them to do it, or you can be the product owner and then you can hire a team and do it. Like I'm the CEO. I'm hands off.
Right.
Figure it out. But I'm giving you a budget of money. Like, what's your next step? How would you handle it in that instance?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is the CEO is only going to give you a one-liner, right? They're going to say,
Here's
yes. What I need."
Right. Yeah.
As a product,
Yeah.
widget, whatever.
Yeah.
There's a lot vertically underneath that, right? So as an agile coach, Scrum Master, whatever, that's my first order of business is trying to figure out what does this thing look like? How deep is this, right? I would put aside that number in our example, 300,000, because I don't know if that's real. I mean, is that sufficient to do what they want? Is that overkill? I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ignore that, and I will focus on finding out what really needs to be done.
Right.
And there's various ways of doing that. If I have access to a product owner, that's the ideal way.
Yeah.
But if I don't have access to a product owner, I need access to actual potential users of this thing, right?
Sure.
And then ask them what's important to them, and then build up from that side rather than a one-liner. Now I've got functional requirements from these people that need to be met.
Oh, do you feel like you're stepping into the role of product owner at that point?
Yes.
I mean, you're basically like you're like I guess this is really like it's an unfair example because I'm really shortcutting a lot of stuff, but like I don't know if it is like because we were a startup and we were 20 people and I had some funding money or whatever, like a lot of companies do now. And I were to just come to you because I know that you have the skill at a lot of different positions, and I'm just like, here's a bucket of money. You know, there's $300 whatever $1,000 in an account. Go build me like I'll give you a great example. A company that I was contracted with, they had $300,000 in an account, and they said we want to budget this money. It was budgeted over a certain. It was capitalized over a certain amount of time, amortized over a certain amount of time. I'm not going to like drag this down to an actual budgeting discussion because I love talking about budgeting. But basically they had a certain amount of money. It was $100,000 a year for the next 3 years, basically, and they were willing to take that money, spin up a team, develop a mobile app to fill this specific market segment. They had subject matter experts on retainer that they were trying to sell a specific product to. They actually had two companies in mind that they wanted to sell the product to. So they knew the market they wanted to break into. It was a new market they were not in. They wanted to break into this market. They had an idea what they wanted the application to do, which leveraged a lot of stuff their other products were doing, but they wanted it to do it very well. Rather than serving a broader audience of customers, they wanted it to serve a very niche audience within their audience customer, and they had some experts that they were willing to tap into, which was not included in your budget, by the way. The company would pay for that, the leveraging of the experts. So you had $300,000 to basically build the MVP of the app. Okay, so at the point where I hand you that money, like, do you morph into that role of the product owner and be like, I'll be the product owner now. I'll coordinate with these other people. I'll figure out what I need, and then I'll just start rolling on developers, testers, whatever. Like, is that where the budget starts, or do you start as like an agile coach and you hire a product owner? Like that's really where my question is. Like, is the person who controls the budget necessarily supposed to be the product owner? I don't know. You know what I mean?
No. I don't believe so. And most organizations, they have this role as a product manager.
Sure. Yeah.
And other organizations have product manager, and others yet have both, right? Mm-hmm. So it tends to be on your perspective, right? So if you have a person who is responsible for a product, and I'm going to ignore the actual title deliberately here, if they are facing the stakeholders. Mm-hmm. They're called a product manager because they are tasked with a product to fill, a market need, et cetera, right, sure, in the portfolio of the company. Now, you turn that person around 180, they're now facing the team, and in the Scrum jargon, they are now a product owner. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's the same person, sometimes it's not. But they are responsible for delivering value to the business for a certain amount of expense that they are also managing. So if I have access to come back to your question, if I have access to such an individual, then I would make them own the budget, mm-hmm, and help them, coach them along and say, this is kind of like the process. You need to figure out, what is the actual usability of this thing, right? What are the needs behind that? Yeah. Because we don't even know in our example here, if $300,000 is adequate, overkill, not enough, etc. We don't know that. Yeah. So once we've gone through the exercise of figuring out all of the functionalities that are needed, and not wanted or desired, just needed, you would then say, let's prioritize those. You have to have a login, for instance, just an example, that. Yeah. It has to be secure, right? Yeah. Things like that. And start building them, right? Start building those. And then over the course of a little bit of time that you spend building something, which is highest priority, right, you now figure out how much you're building for how much, if that makes sense. Yeah. So you just spent, let's say, 2 sprints, and you've built X amount of functionality. Mm-hmm. Now your product backlog is a multiple of X, right? Mm-hmm. And you see how many sprints it's going to take you to get there. Mm-hmm. Now what you've arrived at is the cost it's going to be to deliver all of that. So if 2 sprints is X $1,000, then 20 sprints is Y $1,000.
Right, yeah, of course, yeah.
Now you could say, well, does Y now come close to 300,000 or not? And you do that up front, like literally within 2 to 3 sprints, because you don't want to wait till later.
Yeah, but this time, like, you have to spend time hiring people, though. Like, you have to spin people up,
You do have to do that. So let's say it's, a little bit more than just a couple of sprints.
Mm-hmm.
But my point here is do it earlier rather than later, so that if you had to go back to the CEO, if I had to come back to you and say, Brian, you as a CEO gave me $300,000, not even close, right? But I'm doing that as soon as possible.
Yeah.
I'm not doing that months from now.
You're right, yeah.
Right? I think that's where the power of kind of working out the cost of a sprint, working out how much you have in your hopper, right? And you can actually get a little bit more advanced as well, right? What you could do is say, here are the number of stories that you have in your product backlog.
Yeah.
Give them all business value, right? And then start delivering.
Yeah.
After 2, 3 sprints, 4, whatever it is, 4 sprints later, you can say, I've delivered this much in 4 sprints. Well, I know the cost of 4 sprints, right? It's pretty simple to work out. I know I've delivered X number of points. These are not story points. These are business value points.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know I need to deliver Y. Therefore, I need Y divided by X number of sprints.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that's a simple calculation. Obviously, there's a little bit of adjustment there. You would say plus or minus. You never give absolutes. But I think the earlier you can go back to the CEO and say, yeah, we can do this. Or no, we can't do this. Or we can do this if we had this much extra.
Yeah.
Right? That helps.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think the more realistic thing in this example is like we're starting to do it.
Yep.
And we look like we're going to come to this point. We're going to come to this point by the time we run out of your budget. But we haven't talked about my example probably shortcuts a lot of stuff because my example doesn't talk at all about a timeline.
Right.
And if you're the CEO or if you're a chief, chief product officer, like a CPO, like a chief product guy or whatever. You're probably money is probably the second option. Like the time to market is probably the first thing. So it's like I'm going to give you a timeline, and the money kind of follows that. That's probably the more realistic thing. I'm kind of shortcutting that for the purposes of this discussion. But like since you kind of segued into it, I don't even know if you brought it up or if I brought it up with my own ridiculous brain. That's probably the more relevant thing, which is I start actually I give you the money to kind of explore the topic.
Right.
I think that's kind of that's the thing missing out of this discussion that we haven't really talked about and probably doesn't get talked about enough, which is I need money to figure out how fast we're going. I need a some kind of starter budget to kind of get the initiative going to even explore. Give me a team so that we can at least get estimates or whatever. Or we can churn in some kind of working prototype or whatever. I don't know what it is, but after that, and we put in some kind of once we have something down on paper, I can tell you we have 10 features and we can do 1 feature a sprint. So if you want to get these features in half the time, you need twice the team. So you need to basically double our team budget.
Yep.
If you want to get the same amount of features in half the time, theoretically double our team budget. But I mean, because every team is not going to work exactly the same. So it's.
Yeah,
I understand what I'm saying. It's not exactly right.
Double,
it's not exactly double. But if I'm up in an old school project manager going to my steering committee or whatever for funding, that's basically what I'll start. I'll open up with I need at least an extra 50%, whatever, 100% on top of whatever my budget is, 50%. I need an extra double of whatever I have in order to spend up another team in order to cut the timeline in half. It totally makes sense on paper to say if you want to cut your timeline in half, you have to spend twice the amount of money. That makes sense to me, right?
Yep.
For agile teams, it's not as clear to me when you go back to whatever organization you work for. It's very clear to me if you work for a chief product officer and they have a dedicated budget.
Right.
Then it's very clear to me. You just go back to one person and you say, hey, can you spin off part of your budget and we can spin up another team and we can get this stuff done in half the time or whatever. But you have to make that initial investment of money, I would think, to have any kind of metrics or any kind of numbers or any kind of facts, basically.
You're absolutely right. So I think the concept of having some seed corn funding to explore is really valid,
Yeah.
especially in the unknowns. So developing software is not an exact science, So I think it's good to have an idea of what the products should shape up like,
Yeah.
and then say, let's go try that a little bit. Here's some money, right? Just go spin up a single team, and go see what you can do. And what it will do is not just see how far you can climb those stairs, right? But it will also improve the backlog as you go forward and discuss it more. It will come about that, certain things that we didn't even think about are actually needed. Let's say security and things like that.
Yeah.
Usability, accessibility, things like that. So based on those cumulative experiences, you'd be able to say, we can run this far. In order to run the rest of the way, we need a certain pace, right? And that pace has that certain cost. And it's really a straight line. And I know real life is not a straight line equation, but this is the best science we have. So we can take that, and then we can say, plus or minus X%.
Yeah.
With this budget, we're fairly confident we can hit it. And now the rest of the way, it's just managing scope. Yeah.
So, I guess the only thing that's so weird to me is the case of spinning up something that truly is new.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that's weird to me, because if it's not new, it should already have a cost down on paper, like the team cost, the amount that you pay people. You know what I mean? Like the number of people on the team, the amount that you pay them over the course of the year or whatever. Like, that's all a set number, and then they should have all the other metrics that we're used to tied to it. So you should know what you should be able to get out of those teams, even if you're to pivot those teams to other things. The only case that is really strange to me that I haven't dealt with regularly, that's why I'll put it, I haven't dealt with regularly, is spinning up a truly new team in the instance that I was talking about, where I'm the CEO, I come to you and it's like, hey, I want to explore this new product.
So I really don't think it's any different than having a team.
Yeah.
The thing that's different is you don't know how well the team's going to work.
Right.
So what it translates to is, in the previous case, you might have waited, let's say, 4 sprints, for example, right?
Right.
You may have to wait 6 sprints because this team has to gel together and start to really harmonize, right, and produce something that is in unison with each other. That may take a little bit of time. Allow for that. But that's a one-time cost. So when you come up with that number and you say, okay, it's taken us, let's say, 6 sprints to complete X number of business value points, but we have 20X to deliver still.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a straight line, but it really isn't, because that bonding cost up front, you're not going to pay that again if you can keep the team constant.
Yeah, right.
Right? So I would, I would use that to your advantage. I would say, let's say instead of 20X, it's now 18X, because we are getting that advantage up front that we spent. We don't have to spend again.
Yeah.
But you have to keep an eye on it the whole time, because if your team starts to churn again, you've gone back.
Right, yeah. If you can keep your churn down,
Yeah.
if you can keep your churn down, and your velocity continues to steadily, even if it's slow to increase, if velocity continues to increase, you look like heroes at that point, because you start delivering over and above what the budget is.
Yep.
And tearing into your backlog or whatever, whatever it is, goals, whatever you want to call it.
You can look at, in addition to velocity, you can look at the say-do ratio, right? The team said they're going to lift this much, and they lifted X, right?
Yeah.
And sprint on sprint. So if that say-do ratio is fairly constant, then the team has settled, right? If it's fluctuating, you look at the reasons why and try and fix those, right?
Yeah.
I think the goal there is continuous pace,
Right.
like constant pace, I should
Right.
say. If you have constant pace, you can predictably say it's 20 sprints in my example.
Right.
But because they've already bonded, etc., it might be more like 18.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be communicating that yet, right? I'd be saying still 20 until we're in the last third of it, and then say, okay, we think we might finish early, but I'd rather under-promise and over-deliver, basically.
Sure.
It's just knowing that you have that budget to complete the job, because there's always stuff that happens last minute through UAT, etc. We've been there, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I just allow for that as well. Yeah. But analogous is the place to start if you have that luxury. If you don't have the luxury, then it really is, a case of there's 2 things you can do. One is do this, right? Put your finger up in the air and say which way the wind's blowing.
Yeah.
That's not so good. What you could do instead, and it's a little bit more palatable to senior execs, is to say, well, let me take a bite out of this and see how long it takes me to chew through that, right? So, and before I commit.
Mm-hmm.
So do that for a few sprints. Spin up a team, do that for 2 or 3 sprints and say, now I think I have historical data that I can extrapolate, right? And then adjust a little bit here and there. You're going to be close.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic to me because I think a lot of people could benefit from where do you start when nothing exists? Number one, because some people are cutting over from traditional organizations, like deciding to adopt Agile for the first time, and then they're trying to shove their Agile into their existing waterfall processes or whatever that they had before, and then they don't really get a clean implementation of clean. It's a terrible word. But you know what I'm saying? Like they don't. They're not really getting the advantages of agility in their organization because they're trying to fit it into the budgeting that they had previous. Which is funny because I feel that having gone through. In my career, having gone through the exercise of working with accounting to figure out how to capitalize software projects in the Agile space, it was actually very easy because get ready, 2 people on the internet for this helpful advice. But for me, it was the Scrum model is 20% of your time is in meetings. So I was like, well. For external use, customer use software, you can only capitalize time that's not spent in plannings. And I was like, well, that's great because the only time anyone spends in plannings is 20% of everyone's time, product owner, Scrum Master aside, 20% of everyone's time in the Scrum events. Because other than that, they should pretty much be coding, and any planning is like collaborative between developers, peer programming type of planning, which is basically counted as work because they're doing the knowledge work at that point. Mm-hmm. So it's basically programming. It's just deciding how they're going to program something, which is actual development. So I was like, easy, no problem. Subtract the product owner and the Scrum Master, put them over here in the time bucket, take all the developers, put them over here, subtract 20% of your time, and boom, that's all of the amortization that you need to do to capitalize your whole software budget. And they're like, is it really that easy? I'm like, yeah, actually, yes. When you deploy a framework and you have the Scrum Master who's responsible for ensuring that everyone's, they're the I don't know, like people are gonna get mad when I say the Scrum Master owns the framework or the process, but like that they own the framework. When they own the process and they're ensuring that everyone's on the process and the developers aren't getting pulled into random meetings and whatever, it's like in my career, it's been a little bit easier with more mature teams than with more junior team members, because the junior team members, they kind of don't want to say no to things as people pull them in or whatever. But like with more senior team members, they will involve their Scrum Master when people try to pull them into things. So they will be more stringent in sticking to that 20% of time. Like I'll give you another example of the sticking to. Oh, it's not me. So where I was going was, I will give you an example of what I'm talking about, sticking to the 20% rule, which is if the overhead of Scrum is 20%, and you're going to say I can only capitalize 80% of the developer's time, then you need to make sure that you don't eat into their time over that 20%. And the way you do that is, like for example, one of the things I went through with my team was I made my Scrum Master very, very hyper aware of anything the developers were doing outside of the Scrum events. Okay, and one of the things we found out that the developers were doing outside the Scrum events is they would get done with the sprint planning. You tell me if this is familiar to you. Okay, I'm pretty sure you're probably going to have a good one about this one. Like they would get done with the sprint planning. They would plan whatever they would plan their tasks, their development tasks, and the testers would plan their tasks, stuff like that. And they'd get done with that. But then after they were done with that, they would still have certain questions that were not completely filled, that they would need either a development lead or a team member for another team or whatever. And as the sprint would go along, they would do a bit more planning by talking to other developers on other teams. And you can make the case that, like, well, they're still doing knowledge work, so it sort of is development. But I was like, yeah, but it's like, you don't know how you're going to develop the feature when we get a sprint planning. So, like, your planning technically is not done. And what I told my Scrum Master was, you need to bring, the team needs to, they need to have a general awareness of what we're about to talk about in sprint planning. Or we need to break the sprint planning into two parts and have a very quick, like, this is what I want to work on. And then the team needs to look at it, and we all need to look at it together. And then they need to go, basically the team, I'm going to say it the way that I say it, and we can gel it down to what it really means. The team needs to demand that the subject matter experts or the proper people need to be in the room when they're planning how to do that work. Okay? Because if they can't get all their planning done to be like, this is exactly how we're going to do this work in the time I have allotted, then they can't stick to that 20% time box.
Yeah, that's very true. So one of the models that I've been using of late, successfully I might add, is, let the team know, right, up front, that this is their charter, this is what they have to do.
Right.
And if you're out of sprint planning and you don't know still, then we need to talk about that. So I split the sprint planning into two pieces.
Yeah.
The first is the what I call the what part, right? Mm-hmm. Where the product owner is present and simply confirming, here's our backlog, this is the top X number of features that we're looking at, stories, whatever. And this is the priority. Do you agree? This is your last chance to move anything within that X, right?
Right.
So once we have that direction from them, and we actually get that overtly by having them mark those stories as approved. So now we know, right, that these are the ones that it's perfectly safe to work on because they've approved them.
Right.
And they've also prioritized them. That's a quick meeting, usually, under an hour, well under an hour. Dysfunctions there would be when team members start asking about questions. Like, what was that all about again? That means that we didn't do a good enough job in refinement.
Right. Yeah.
So we can remedy all that.
Yeah.
So the first part is well under an hour. The PO then takes off, and we break into teams. So we then have a break essentially because it's an hour's long enough.
Mine are on the schedule for 1 hour actually.
Exactly.
They're on the schedule for 1 hour.
Same.
Yeah.
Yep. And then the team gets together without the PO. Now they have their marching orders, right? They know what they have to work on. Now they figure out how they're going to deliver that.
Right.
Which is a discussion among the team, looking at those stories and say, yes, they're ranked in terms of what the product owner wants, but in reality, we need to do number 8 first because there's a dependency on it, with some of these other ones.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's a team level discussion, and they figure that out. And then they go ahead and task those out, right? Then they get together at the end of the day, typically, of the sprint planning day, and say, we've done tasking out. I simply look at that and say, based on capacity available, et cetera, you've got roughly the right number of task hours because people at the PMO level are tracking those things for the task burn down.
Right, yeah.
To me, it's irrelevant, but that's fine. That's what they're tracking, so that's what we give them. But we end the day always with a sprint commit and say, the PO's identified a dozen things, we can only commit to 10.
Yeah.
And I always advise my teams to commit at least 5% under. The reason is, a sprint is, in our case, it's 3 weeks, but 2 to 3 weeks long. Things happen during the sprint where you have to pivot, right? You have to satisfy other teams' dependencies, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So there's unknowns, and that's why the 5% under commit. That doesn't mean we under-deliver, though, because what happens if nothing turns up is, those things that are approved, the team is at liberty to bring them into the sprint.
Yeah.
And that's fine. And that is working really well, that particular approach, right? The PO is now understanding of that. So they're not forcing the team or coercing the team in any way by saying, hey, how come last time you took 12 and now you're only taking 8 or 9 or 10, whatever. Yeah. They're not doing that anymore. They just say it's up to the team, which is exactly right. It should be up to the team. And then the last thing I'll say on this is this. Just because something is approved doesn't mean that the team has to be obligated to work on that. Things happen and the team discovers something, let's say a dependency on an external team, so that approved item cannot be delivered.
Yeah.
In that case, do 2 things. Communicate that to the PO right now and say, we can't do this now, right? We're going to defer it to the next sprint. We want you to know. and here's why, right? And then say, before they ask, then say, in its stead, we're going to bring this in, right? And if it's approved, great, everything's fine. But if it's not approved, that's the time where you ask the PO for approval and say, we're going to bring this in. Is this okay with you? Is there anything else you'd rather us work on, right? And I think that's also good because it fosters that collaboration and trust between the PO and the team.
Yeah, I actually went through this very recently because my team worked on something that the business said, well, until feature Z was ready, you can't roll feature X and Y into production, which I disagreed with, but I understood why the business was telling me that, but what they roll into production, I could care less. I really don't care as a product owner. I'm like, we're finishing it. You can make the argument that like, well, it comes back on you, the product owner, to not work on things that are not going to go to production. You should have worked on the first thing they want to production, and that kind of breaks down when you talk about like when things have dependencies or whatever, all that kind of stuff like is up in the air. But in my instance, it was more important to work on the things that were just complete grenades that would, if they would have not turned out at all conditions being perfect, they would have blown my whole project up. So I had to work on them first, even though I couldn't deploy them first. So in that instance, I worked on item X and item Y, and then in the third sprint, I worked on item Z. But after I completed item Z, I could deploy X and Y and Z together. And I had to make that decision, and I had to go back to the business to be the fall guy, basically, to to get yelled at or whatever. Why haven't we seen anything get rolling? It's not as easy. Like agile development is like it's a what's it called? Potentially shippable product. Like that's the thing. Yeah, I found out like sometimes you have to deal with the hard situation of like it's potentially, but we can't. You know what I mean? We just can't do it. And I went through that recently, so it's an interesting situation. What you just said reminded me of that.
I think if you have a product owner who understands that, it makes life easier.
I mean, the negative, like the thing that I took away from that is I should have gone well ahead of my team to set that expectation with them. That's where I did not do that very well. If I have to say anything. Take responsibility in this on myself. I did not set the good expectation to the business to be like, in order to implement feature Z, I first have to do X and Y, and here's the reason. And I should have pulled all the users into it. The issue with product ownership is sometimes you don't really fit into any of the Scrum event boxes or whatever. But that's okay. Mm-hmm. That's okay because I tell the product owners that I work with, I'm like, well, as a product owner, you're like 50% of your time is with your teams or whatever, but 50% of your time is with the business, quote, air quotes, the business. And that's kind of like my sweet, I mean, it's not science or anything. That's kind of like my sweet spot where I try to make everyone happy. That's the way I feel makes everyone happy. 50-50. Obviously, like with more than two teams, you start digging into your availability of 50% here, 50% there. Right? It's not possible when you have three teams because now you're dedicated 60% with your teams. So 60-40, now you're sub-optimizing something. With four teams, you're just all the business side is going out the window. With five teams, you don't even have time to talk to the business.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Right.
So for me, that's another reason to come back to the topic of budgeting because when you're a product owner. Like we'll take this back to being a product owner. When you're a product owner and you start getting to the point where you have 3 teams, 4 teams, or whatever, you have to start going back to whoever you work for, a CEO, or if a product owner is in the very strange spot of working for like a CTO or something like that, a product under technology somehow, not under the business, strange spot. You have to start saying, look, I can't spend enough time with.
Absolutely.
Forging a future or whatever because I have so much time where I'm just trying to deal with my teams or whatever. And again, like I told my product owner when I started talking about this subject today, I started down the road of talking to my product owner saying the product owner where I'm transitioning onto saying the response to that is, well, what can we do to make you more effective? Well, the thing is you can relieve me of my responsibilities with with whatever teams or bring on another product owner, transition some of these roles. I'm too busy. We need another person. We've evolved this role to where we need another person. The the response that you do not need, and the conversation you do not need to get pulled into is like, well, do you really need an hour for sprint planning? Do you really need an hour and a half for a retro? Do you like that is not a useful conversation.
I fully agree. It's not.
Yeah. But the budgeting, like again, like I really like the topic of budgeting because I think a lot of organizations just like they're trying to implement agility and take a lot of benefits from what agility is and can offer, but are trying to use the incorrect model of budgeting to make this model successful. And man, hopefully somebody can listen to the stuff that we talked about today and like find it useful to be like, launching it. If you're taking a team that you have and launching them in this different methodology, it's kind of not that difficult because they have a set cost.
Yes.
The team has a set cost. If you're trying to launch something new, again, even that's not that difficult. You know you have some kind of launch costs. Starting up a new team, you already know you have some kind of launch costs.
Yes.
You have some kind of set cost to starting a new team. So even that, I don't think is that difficult. I think this topic, like when I started talking about this topic, I think it was from a place where like I just didn't understand. It seems too much in the clouds for me to be grounded in reality to talk about the topic. But as I kind of talked out the subject, I'm like, actually, it's really not. It's really like just come up with a dollar figure and we'll figure out what we get from there and kind of spin off.
Yeah, so when you're communicating with these leaders, right, at the C level, you need to keep away from this sprint jargon or agile jargon and just use the terms they understand.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're talking to a CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, talk about time to market, opportunity cost, right? Those kinds of things, market share, grabbing that early or whatever it is. You're talking to a CFO, dollars and cents.
Yeah.
Right. Talking to HR, talk to what's important there. So I think that is key. Is adjusting the delivery language to these people because you can bamboozle them with all this techno geek, right?
Yeah.
And they don't understand it.
Right.
And it will not serve you well in the big picture.
Oh, man. Talking to people in a way they understand, like, this is witchcraft.
It's hard enough to
Sorcery.
explain to those that are from the old school of thought the concept of value streams, let alone go down to the next level, which is micro value streams, right? So within a product, which facets of the product should be funded?
Yeah.
Not just the product holistically, but aspects of it.
Yeah.
Right. Again, based on market demand and the potential to make money or save costs, right? That's another level. And I think if you can get to them even at the first level, you've won. And then keep at it. Over time you'll get there. Engage them in these discussions when you talk about value streams and map those value streams and make sure that they understand visibly, right, or visually, right, what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
But always use in your language their terminology.
Yeah.
So there's no translation required.
Budgeting.
Yeah.
What a fun topic.
Great topic.
Oh, man.
Sadly, it only happens once a year. So.
Okay. Well, we're done.
Okay.